Johannesburg, the most vibrant city in South Africa, was the pulsating heart of the nation. The hot climate and the frantic pace of the streets coexisted with the heavy history buried deep within its core. But for Sarah Mthembu, a young historian born and raised in Soweto, everything seemed normal. Up to a point, she lived a simple life, residing with her parents in a modest home, surrounded by the hustle and bustle of the city. Sarah spent her days studying the history of her people, the struggles against apartheid, and the profound impact that events like the 1976 Soweto uprising had on the Black community. On that hot August day, Sarah was working on her research about the massacre. She had always felt drawn to history, especially the idea that, while apartheid had ended, the ghosts of the past never truly left the streets of Soweto. Sarah was writing about the student protests that filled the streets on that fateful day and the thousands of lives lost. That part of the city still breathed the spirit of resistance, but she didn't know that soon, history itself would take a much more tangible form. At first, her studies seemed to be just another academic journey. However, as she walked through the streets of Soweto, gathering oral testimonies to include in her work, Sarah began to sense that something was changing. Every corner, every street, seemed to whisper the names of the dead, the voices of the students who had cried out for freedom and died for it. She couldn't tell whether it was the city itself or her mind, but she felt the presence of those souls in a way she never had imagined. Sarah was at the home of an elderly family friend, known for having lived through the Soweto massacre.
Mrs.
Qunu was a wise old woman whose memory was filled with the most painful and powerful stories of the anti-apartheid movement. Sarah found her sitting in a rocking chair, staring blankly out of the window. "There's much you don't know about that day," Mrs. Qunu said, as if she knew exactly what Sarah was searching for. "But there's more to it than you think. The blood that was spilled in the streets has not been forgotten, my child." Intrigued, Sarah asked what she meant. Mrs. Qunu led her to the backyard, where a small garden rested. She pointed to an old lamppost near the fence. "It was here, at this corner, where the children fell. They fell one by one, and their bodies were left to rot. But some say, even today, you can hear the gunshots if you listen closely." Curious, Sarah walked toward the lamppost. As she passed it, an inexplicable sensation washed over her. It was as though the city had gone silent, a deep and heavy silence. And it was in that silence that she heard what sounded like the echo of distant gunshots reverberating from the very ground. Sarah stood frozen, trying to understand what was happening. She didn't know whether it was an illusion or if something else was going on. She turned to Mrs. Qunu, but the woman was no longer there. The only thing that remained was the sound of gunshots, growing louder and closer. In the following days, Sarah began to feel a growing weight on her shoulders. She couldn't stop hearing the sound of gunshots in her mind, during her sleep, and sometimes even while walking through the streets of Soweto. She tried to focus on her work, but it seemed that the voices of the dead were calling to her, as if they wanted her to go beyond simple historical research. On a Friday afternoon, she decided to return to the square where the massacre had occurred. When she arrived, she noticed the area was deserted, but there was something different. The wind was stronger, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move in a strange way, as if they were trying to escape the sunlight. Sarah looked around, and her attention was drawn to a small figure standing out among the imaginary crowd of ghosts that seemed to have invaded the square for a moment. A child, dressed in a school uniform, was standing and staring directly at her. Their eyes were empty, expressionless, and their face was pale, lifeless. Sarah approached the child, but before she could say anything, the figure disappeared. The only thing left was the sound of gunshots echoing in the distance. The steps Sarah heard afterward were accompanied by the eerie feeling of being watched, as though someone was observing her with a cold and vengeful gaze. It was that night, during the last day of her research, that Sarah had her most terrifying experience. She was alone in her house, reviewing her notes. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered. Sarah looked around, trying to identify what was causing the strange behavior of the bulbs. But before she could react, the lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. When the lights came back on, Sarah saw something that froze her in place. The room was now filled with shadowy figures, shadows of children, their faces contorted in silent screams. They were all around her, in every corner of the room, their empty eyes fixed on her. She tried to move, but her feet were frozen to the floor. Then she heard a soft, almost inaudible voice, whispering her name. "Sarah, Sarah." Panic overtook her, and as she tried to run, the shadows began to move, advancing toward her. But just as she was about to scream, everything went dark again. Sarah woke up hours later, her heart pounding. The house was silent, but she knew she wasn't alone. The spirits of the children, the lost souls of the Soweto massacre, had communicated with her. She didn't know how, but the screams still echoed in her mind, and the gunshots still reverberated in the air. In the following days, Sarah tried to understand what had happened, but she knew she had crossed a line between the physical world and the supernatural. No matter how much she wanted to ignore it, the voices of the dead still spoke to her. She continued her research, but she was never the same. Whenever she looked at the horizon of Soweto, she felt the presence of the dead surrounding her. The shadows never left her in peace, and every time the streets quieted at night, Sarah knew that the souls who had died there during the massacre were still wandering among the living. Something far worse was yet to come. In Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, life continued with its frenetic and vibrant routine. The city, marked by a historical tragedy, still breathed an atmosphere of reconstruction and overcoming after the 1994 genocide, during which more than 800,000 people, mostly from the Tutsi ethnic group, were brutally murdered in the span of 100 days. Despite the deep scars left by the violence, the city was slowly flourishing. The sound of laughter in the market, the smell of local food, and the daily routines of the city seemed far removed from any memory of a dark past. However, for some, especially the elders, the memories of the massacre were still fresh, and the invisible marks of the genocide's violence could not be easily erased. Kazia, a young anthropology student studying at the University of Kigali, had heard many stories from her grandmother about the events of that period. Her grandmother often spoke of a presence, something beyond human understanding, an energy that haunted the streets of Kigali and the surrounding countryside. Though Kazia didn't entirely believe in supernatural stories, she knew that the genocide had left deep wounds in the soul of the country. She began documenting these accounts to understand the connection between the horrors of the past and the present, unaware that she herself would soon become part of this terrifying history. It was a hot and sunny afternoon when Kazia decided to visit an old cemetery on the outskirts of Kigali, where many of the victims of the genocide had been buried in mass graves. She had heard that at night, some people reported seeing shadowy figures and hearing screams coming from that place. Kazia was determined to investigate. The landscape around the cemetery was peaceful, with green fields and small hills stretching as far as the eye could see. She walked through the field, feeling the weight of the silence, as if the place were holding on to the memories of everything that had happened there. When she reached the cemetery, a strange sensation enveloped her. The wind seemed to whisper her name, and a biting cold filled her body, despite the afternoon heat. Kazia took a photo of the location, and when she looked at the image on her camera screen, something made her stop. In the background of the photo, amid the vegetation, she could have sworn she saw a human figure. It wasn't a reflection, but something clear and distinct, a tall person wearing tattered clothes, as if standing at the edge of the field. She quickly looked around, but no one was there. Startled, Kazuya thought it could just be a trick of the light, a play of shadows. She decided to head back to the city, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave her. When she got into the car and looked at the rearview mirror, she saw a shadow of someone sitting in the back seat. Her heart raced, and she looked quickly behind her, but no one was there. She sped up, trying to shake off the fear, but something deep inside her knew the place was marked by something much darker. In the following days, Kazuya couldn't shake the image of the figure in the photo from her mind. Her curiosity turned into obsession, and she began researching more about the cemetery and the legends surrounding it. She spoke to local residents and genocide survivors, and they all mentioned the same thing: a ghostly presence that haunted the field, a figure that materialized at night, and in some cases, even touched people, leaving them with an indescribable sense of dread. One evening, Kazuya decided to return to the cemetery, armed with a camera, a recorder, and a notebook. She wanted to document any supernatural phenomenon, but at the same time, she wasn't sure what she was expecting to find. She arrived at the site just before dusk. The environment was silent, but the feeling that something was about to happen hung in the air. The wind picked up, and the sky grew cloudy. As night fell, Kazuya heard footsteps in the distance. When she turned, she saw a tall figure approaching the field. It was a person, but their silhouette was distorted, as if being projected by a dense shadow. The figure's face was not visible, but she could feel the eyes fixed on her. Fear paralyzed her for a moment, but she knew she needed to document what was happening. She grabbed the camera, and before she could take a photo, the figure quickly advanced. The sense of terror intensified, and suddenly, Kazuya felt a presence beside her. She looked to her left and saw a woman dressed in blood-stained clothes, her eyes hollow with pain and suffering. The woman didn't speak, but her eyes seemed to ask for something Kazuya didn't understand. When the figure reached out to touch her shoulder, Kazuya screamed and ran to her car, but the woman followed, always just a step behind. The sound of bare feet hitting the ground echoed behind her, but when she looked back, the woman had disappeared, as if she had never existed. Kazuya was terrified, but she wasn't ready to give up just yet. The next morning, she reviewed the recordings and photos she had taken, hoping to find a rational explanation for what had happened. However, when she watched the video recorded during the night, she saw something she never expected. In the footage, she could see the figure of the woman with the empty eyes slowly approaching, her expression distorting as the camera captured her movement. The most disturbing thing, however, was the sound that was captured on the recorder. There were words, whispered in an unknown language, followed by a piercing scream that seemed to come from the depths of hell. Kazuya had never heard anything so deep, so terrifying. In the last recording, the woman appeared again, but this time her expression was even more horrific. Her eyes were completely white, and her mouth stretched into a macabre smile. She was standing in front of Kazuya, staring at her, until she suddenly vanished, like black smoke dissolving into the wind. Kazuya never fully understood what she had encountered at that cemetery. Her research on the genocide, and her attempts to document the supernatural phenomena, led her down a path of terror she could never have predicted. She was forced to leave Kigali, not just out of fear, but because she knew she wasn't prepared to face what was hidden in that place. She tried to find a logical explanation, but every time she thought about the events, the image of the woman with the empty eyes appeared in her mind, like a constant shadow. Years later, Kazuya returned to Kigali, now with a family and a quieter life. However, the feeling that something was missing never left her. She didn't know if what she had seen at the cemetery was real or a product of her tormented mind. But the stories of ghostly figures and vengeful spirits continued to circulate in Rwanda. On a rainy night, while at home, Kazuya received a phone call. The voice on the other end of the line was distorted, but she could make out the words, They're still there. What you saw isn't over. They're coming for you. The people of Kankana, a small and isolated village deep in Uganda, lived on the fringes of modern civilization. Most of the residents worked in agriculture, growing maize, cassava, and sweet potatoes, while others fished in the nearby lake. Life was simple, without many technological advancements, and communication with the outside world was limited. The village was surrounded by dense forests and mountains that seemed to hide secrets no one dared to speak of. Benezer Okwera, a young journalist from Kampala, had heard rumors about Kankana and its connection to an ancient legend. He decided to spend a weekend in the village to investigate what was real behind the stories that had circulated for decades. Many villagers spoke of a mythical creature, a monster that roamed the forests and hunted those brave enough to venture into its trails at night. The creature was described in various ways. Some said it looked like a giant panther with glowing red eyes, while others spoke of a humanoid being with dark skin and a deadly rage. To many, the legend was intertwined with the history of a brutal murder that had occurred in the village many years ago, a crime that was never solved. Benezer, skeptical about the possibility of a real monster, viewed this as just another curiosity for his reports. He arrived in Kankana, intending to interview the elders and understand where the legend had come from. What he didn't know was that, upon his arrival, he would soon become a part of a much darker story than any article he had ever written. As soon as Benezer arrived in Kankana, he was welcomed by the village chief, an elderly man named Maizi Kato, who seemed to be the guardian of the village's ancient stories. Kato, with his piercing eyes and raspy voice, spoke little, but it was clear that he knew far more about the monster legend than he was willing to share. When Benezer directly asked about the creature, the chief hesitated for a moment before saying, "The monster of Kankana is not a story. It exists, but only if you're foolish enough to go looking for it." Benezer laughed this off, thinking that Kato was just joking. But as evening approached, he began to hear things, strange sounds coming from the forest. It was a low noise, like the snap of twigs under a heavy weight. He thought it could be just a wild animal. But what unsettled him was the silence that followed. The forest seemed to fall completely silent, as if all the animals had disappeared. After a simple dinner, Benezer headed to his lodging, but as he passed the edge of the forest, he felt something, as if he were being watched. The lantern light illuminated the trees, and for a moment, he thought he saw something moving between them. He froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end, but when he looked again, nothing was there. It was then that the sound returned, now louder, closer. Benezer quickened his pace, feeling a threatening presence behind him. He entered the house where he was staying, locked the door, and looked out the window, trying to see what was making those noises. But what he saw was even more disturbing. Red eyes glowing in the darkness, staring at him through the window. Panic gripped his body, and he quickly turned away from the window, unsure of what was really happening. In the following days, Benezer heard more stories from the villagers, but always with great caution. Chief Kato, sensing Benezer's growing interest, warned him again, but this time with more seriousness. The monster of Kankana is a vengeful spirit. It was summoned during the massacre of our people many years ago. Since then, it hunts those who try to intrude on what is its domain. No matter what you hear or see, don't go into the forest after sundown. Benezer, more curious than ever, decided that he would enter the forest. He needed to debunk the myth and prove that it was just a story to keep the children in line. He waited until late afternoon, when the sky began to darken, and prepared to venture into the forest alone. As he entered the woods, the atmosphere changed drastically. The air was heavy, and the ground, covered in dry leaves, cracked with every step he took. It was as if the forest itself were alive, reacting to his presence. Benezir wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he was determined to face whatever lay ahead. With every step, the sound of crunching leaves grew louder, and Benezir felt that something was following him. He turned around, but saw nothing, yet the feeling of being hunted grew stronger. When he turned to look ahead, a dark figure appeared before him. It was a massive creature, covered in thick fur, with glowing red eyes reflecting the light from Benezir's lantern. It stood motionless, as though watching him. The monster, which resembled a panther, had long sharp claws and a low growl that echoed through the air. The creature seemed to be enjoying Benezir's fear, which left him paralyzed where he stood. Suddenly, the monster lunged toward him with astonishing speed. Benezir instinctively ran. The ground seemed to give way beneath his feet, and the forest itself seemed to move to prevent his escape. He could hear the creature's paws pounding on the earth, its teeth grinding, as if it were ready to tear him apart. Benezir didn't know how he was managing to run. Panic had taken over his body. He tripped over roots, fell to the ground, but quickly got back up. The creature was now closer, and he could hear its growl growing louder. It was then that, looking back, he saw the monster's face. It wasn't just any creature, but something grotesque, with skin covered in scars and teeth, as sharp as knives. Its red eyes were fixed on him, and Benezir had the chilling sensation that the monster was smiling, as if it was about to savor his death. But just as the monster was about to reach him, the sound of a human scream cut through the air. Benezir stopped for a moment, and then he saw several shadows moving between the trees. Villagers, armed with spears and sticks, appeared out of nowhere, shouting and trying to drive the creature away. The monster, enraged, retreated into the darkness of the forest, disappearing with impossible speed. Benezir was taken back to the village, where the villagers tended to him and calmed him down. Chief Kato explained that the monster of Kankana wasn't a flesh and blood creature. It was a supernatural entity, a vengeful spirit from the old massacres that haunted the forests around the region. It only appeared to those who tried to intrude on its territory or disrespect the sacred history of the village. Benezir didn't know what to think. He was traumatized, but he couldn't deny what he had experienced. The monster existed, and the legend was more alive than ever. In the days that followed, Benezir returned to Kampala, but the image of the monster with glowing red eyes remained vivid in his mind. He tried to write about the experience, but the words failed to capture the terror he had felt. One night, as the darkness deepened, he heard a familiar growl coming from the forest, and he knew, in his heart, that the monster was still watching him, waiting for the next fool brave enough to enter its domain.